Salam, everyone. It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome you all online and those here with us at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University for Emran Feroz's book launch of Graveyard Empire, 4 Decades of Wars and Intervention in Afghanistan, published with Interlink Publishing. Emran Feroz is a journalist, author, and the founder of Drone Memorial, a virtual memorial for civilian drone strike victims. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, the Columbia Journalism Review, and many other publications. He's the author of Death at the Push of a Button, published in 2017, about the US drone warfare, and is also the founder of a virtual memorial for civilian drone victims, www.dronememorial.com. His book, Graveyard Empire, was translated to English by Adam Baldner and first published in German under the title Der längste Krieg, 20 Jahre War and Terror with Westend Verlag. My name is Paniz Musawi Natanzi, by the way. I'm a postdoctoral fellow this year at the Duke University Middle East Studies Center. I would like to thank my colleagues at the John Hope Franklin Center for their work and our co-sponsors of this event, including the Franklin Humanities Institute, Asian American Diaspora Studies, the program Asian American and Diaspora Studies, the History Department, and the program in International Comparative Studies for your time and support that I deeply appreciate, and the Gothic Bookshop, who is selling outside the book. Last but not least, I'd like to thank Emran Feroz for being with us today via Zoom, despite the US government's withdrawal of your travel authorization on Saturday after it was initially approved a month ago. This cancellation is systemic, deeply political, and anything but new. It also reminds us that naturalized citizens and former refugees enjoy all sorts of privileges, but are not immune to the racializing border practices of states in the age of carceral capitalism. In her book, Between the Past and Future, 8 Exercises in Political Thought, Hannah Arendt writes that, and I quote, lies have always been regarded as necessary and justifiable tools, not only of the politicians or the demagogues, but also of the statesman's trade, end of quote. Lies of the occupiers had to be refined in order to humanize the continuous occupation and war in Afghanistan, while the majority of Afghans were placed in a mode of living and working that constituted them as, and I quote, non-subhumans, to use a term by Jasbir Puar from her book, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability. Simultaneously in Afghanistan, the occupiers integrated lessons from US-led military invasions and occupations in the Americas, Caribbean, Pacific, and Asia to optimize the colonial strategy of dividing and conquering the population by training the occupied to conduct counterinsurgency operations, military as well as in the civilian realm. In the human, non-human animal divide, to use another term by Puar, Afghans, just like Palestinians, Sudanese, Kashmiris, Haitians, Yemenis, Vietnamese, and the list goes on, cannot be heard through, quote, palogocentric and thus anthropocentric frames of legibility, end of quote. In Graveyard Empire, Feroz translates manifestations of imperial violence for an audience literate in these frames of legibility. Centering Afghan lives, his book is a testament to how the violence of empire-building processes exacerbates social and political injury and death in the 20th and 21st century in Afghanistan. Feroz's work remembers the dead, the violently killed, maimed, and tortured, and reminds his German and English-speaking readers of the question of reparations and justice for Afghans. In an age when journalists are bound to the editorial vocabulary of their offices, his work as a freelancing and investigative journalist does hold a mirror in front of the US and its periodic as well as long-term allies from Kabul to Doha, Islamabad, and Berlin to Langley and Washington, and including Afghans. An Afghan friend who worked in a project which was funded by the Department of State in Kabul during the occupation told me about Emran Feroz, quote, many cursed Emran when he posted about drones. They claimed that he is a friend of the Taliban. There were few who engaged with what he said. Most did not like his work. Because we could not critically assess the situation, Many harmonized with the Americans. When the Americans attacked the wedding hall, many in the cities would say civilians were killed and among them were Talibs. Imran would not support this narrative, and for that he was given the Talib stamp, end of quote. Lies are often rewarded. What cannot be said of the work of those committed to unpacking them? James Baldwin describes in Creative America that, quote, societies never know it, but the war of an artist, and that includes for him writers, with his society is a lover's war, and he does at his best what lovers do, which is to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation, to make freedom real, end of quote. So Imran will read from his book for about 30 minutes, and then I'll have some questions prepared for him. And subsequently, we open the floor for questions from you, our lovely audience, as well as like the audience that we have online. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Emran Feroz.
Thank you. Thanks, Paniz. Thanks to everyone for having me, for organizing this event. I'm really, really sorry for all the problems. But I'm still very happy that it's taking place in this form. And yeah, thanks also for the introduction. I really appreciate that. And I hope that we will have a fruitful and critical conversation about what happened in Afghanistan during the last 2 decades and beyond, because unfortunately, it's already forgotten again. And maybe some points regarding the translation of the book about Graveyard Empire. So I'm really happy that it's out now, and it was one of my main goals to see a book of mine being translated into English and seeing it published in the United States, because I think it's very important, especially for American audiences, to somehow critically understand what has happened. And this book, the original version of the book, was published in 2021. During the days when the Americans faced its so-called Saigon moment in Kabul, and the US military and its allies withdrew, and the Taliban returned and took over. And since then, more than 2 years passed. So I also updated this book a bit, and we will hopefully talk about that later. Also, some of the chapters I'm going to read now, I hope reading through this, through Zoom, won't become too boring. So I'll try to keep it short and focus more on the conversation. But yeah, some of the parts I'm going to read are also not inside of the German version, but are specifically I wrote them about, I think, 8 months ago, something like that. So let's start it. So maybe another thing I should mention is that, and that which Paniz already mentioned, is that my work was mainly focusing on the war on terror in Afghanistan, and for that reason, one of the first things I started to care about was the American drone warfare in Afghanistan, also in other countries like Pakistan and Somalia and Yemen, but especially in Afghanistan. And one of the chapters of my book is focusing on that. So I structured the book through 6 points. It's called The 6 Greatest Failures of the War on Terror. And the 4th failure is one of these chapters. 4th failure, the terrorism of the Angels of Death and CIA henchmen. And by the way, I'm reading the ebook because I don't have the hard copy yet. Haven't received it by now. Time and again, over the course of the war on terror, it was claimed that civilians were not under attack. Rather, the hunt was solely for terrorists and their leaders. In addition to Osama bin Laden, the Americans' most famous targets included the Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar and the Al-Qaeda vice emir Ayman al-Zawahiri. In order to hunt down these men, a novel, ostensibly precision weapon was deployed in the Afghanistan war for the first time: the armed drone. Piloted by remote teams, these killer machines were supposed to revolutionize how the United States went about pursuing its enemies. To this day, many people imagine drone strikes as flawless Hollywood-style operations with razor-sharp footage distinguishing civilians from armed fighters. At the push of a button, Hellfire missiles then eliminate the bad guys. In this way, according to the narrative, terrorists are killed and innocent people are saved. This picture is not just distorted, but entirely false. This was obvious as early as October 7, 2001, the very first day of the West's mission in Afghanistan. On this day in the southern Kandahar province, the so-called Taliban stronghold, an armed drone was deployed for the first time in human history. Its target was none other than Mullah Omar himself. Yet the Taliban leader was nowhere to be found. Just as it's still the case today, the footage taken by the drones was hardly high resolution. Years later, it came out that drone pilots could neither distinguish children from adults, nor militants with Kalashnikov rifles from miners with shovels. This prompted the US government to invent new terms to justify the killing. In 2012, it was revealed that the US had been officially defining all military-aged males, or MAMs, near the site of a potential drone strike as enemy combatants per se. This was presumably the case on October 7 as well, when the drone operator spotted a house and a group of people and pushed the button. Several people were killed, though the Taliban leader was not amongst them. The same scenario occurred constantly in the following years. Time and again, Omar, bin Laden, and other terrorists were pronounced dead following drone strikes, only to turn up later. Meanwhile, no one bothered asking who had actually been killed instead. According to the British human rights organization Reprieve, the pursuit of 41 terrorists via armed drones led to the killings of as many as 1,147 civilians in Pakistan and Yemen between 2002 and 2014. Until Ayman al-Zawahiri's death by drone strike in 2022, American drones had failed to take out even a single famous target. Mullah Omar died a natural death in 2013, and Osama bin Laden was killed by an American Special Forces unit in 2011. The scenes of these two deaths are also worth noting. According to several reports, Omar died in the Zabul province in southern Afghanistan near a US military base. Bin Laden was killed while hiding out neither in Afghanistan nor in the infamous Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, but rather in the Pakistani garrison city of Abbottabad, approximately 130 miles away from Islamabad, a location crawling with Pakistani military and intelligence. Put simply, the Americans' two most important targets were not hiding in inaccessibly mountain caves or remote villages. Rather, they had been living for years practically under the nose of the hunters. The many people hunted and murdered by predator drones in their stead during the 20 years of the war on terror remain mostly unknown, both nameless and faceless. This owes in part to the fact that very few journalists bothered to report on the victims of the shadowy drone war. There are numerous reasons why this was the case. First, the nature of drone warfare is highly insidious. Due to its limited arsenal of weapons, a drone can only kill a limited number of people by means of a single attack. Thus, while there were numerous instances of the killer machines taking out small groups of agricultural workers or taxi drivers and their passengers, These instances were typically relegated to the margins of the news due to the small total number of dead, if they were even reported at all. Nevertheless, the broader picture is horrifying. According to the London-based Bureau of Investigative Journalism, more than 13,000 drone strikes occurred between January 2015 and December 2019 alone, killing between 4,000 and 10,000 Afghans. Most of the victims were designated as terrorists or terror suspects, adding dehumanization to death. Leading Western media outlets went along with this, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Der Spiegel. In 2018, I conducted a quantitative content analysis of Spiegel Online's coverage of drone strikes, focusing primarily on the outlet's publicly accessible archive. Between September 1, 2001 and April 1, 2018, a search for drone generated 2,467 hits. Among these, 860 articles that could be categorized and analyzed for my research. All in all, only 13 results explicitly named civilian casualties of drone strikes. In this context, critics and analysts have repeatedly noted that false reports from the drone war were extremely rarely amended. Once someone was labeled a terrorist, that label stuck. Even when investigative journalists in the affected regions had proven that the victims had actually been civilians, corrections were not typically issued. This was the case, by the way, with the Washington Post and the New York Times. There was a very detailed study about that. One might thus justifiably speak of an official say journalism that simply disseminated the statements of government bodies instead of critically questioning them. Many Western outlets practice this kind of journalism, serving as a de facto PR departments of the CIA, the Pentagon, and so on. This quickly occurred to me over the course of my work, which is why I increasingly came to the focus on the US drone war's civilian casualties. The true extent of these casualties was unknown to me at the time. So we're talking about 2014, 2013, something like that here. Yet the more I engaged with the topic, the clearer the abyss became. In 2014, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism determined that Afghanistan has been drone bombed more than any other country in the world. Drone warfare came into public consciousness, particularly during the presidency of Barack Obama. Under Obama, there was a tenfold increase in the number of drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, countries where Washington had been prosecuting clandestine anti-terror wars. Obama even personally signed off on these attacks in weekly meetings where the so-called kill list was updated. In order to placate the American public, Obama mainly preferred drones and small special forces units. A remotely controlled safe war looked better than the coffins of fallen US soldiers, as many as 100,000 of whom were present on the ground during parts of the Obama years, more than had been present at any other time. As all of these soldiers stationed in Afghanistan had little to show by way of success, Obama eventually reduced the boots on the ground and opted instead for ostensibly precise anti-terror operations, though these operations actually cost many civilian lives and further escalated the war. Particularly in Germany, it must be always remembered that the drone strikes would not have been possible without data transmission through Ramstein Air Base, the infrastructural beating heart of the US military's illegal drone war. From the start of the war on terror, the buzzing drones became a fact of daily life of numerous Afghans. They even left a cultural imprint, as is revealed by various local names they were given. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, they were referred to in Pashto as Bungai or Rangai, or as Azrael, the name of the angel of death in Islam. Over the course of my research, I personally sought out many drone victims. Some of them were Afghan civilians who are still struggling to survive, whereas others were young or even underage Taliban fighters who knew little about Islamist ideology and simply joined the militants to seek revenge. I encountered particularly tragic cases of drone victims who received neither justice nor any form of compensation for the crimes committed against them. One example was Aisha, a girl all of 4 years of age in 2013, when a Hellfire missile killed her family and severely disfigured her face. In yet another instance of innocent people being presumed to be terrorists, her family's pickup truck was attacked by an American drone near the village of Gambar in Convenor province. In total, 14 were killed. Aisha, the sole survivor, was transported to a French military hospital in Kabul for treatment. She received superior care there, yet her case was taken up by NATO, as news of her fate had already started to get around. The authorities wanted to cover up the entire war crime. For an Afghan girl, having her face and family blown up by a supposedly precise killer machine would have been a PR disaster, exposing the grim everyday reality of the war on terror. At one point in the hospital, a foreign woman approached Aisha's uncle Maya, foisting several documents on him and demanding his signature so that Aisha could receive treatment abroad. Maya was overwhelmed. A mason for Gambar who spoke no English, he himself had just been traumatized by the massacre of his family, and he did not want his niece to travel abroad with strangers. The woman told him that he could come with Aisha if he had a passport, but he did not, just like many Afghans. The following day, the unknown woman appeared once again and ordered him to sign. As Aisha's condition was worsening, he relented. Shortly thereafter, Aisha disappeared. When Maya tried to call the woman from the hospital several days later, it turned out that the number she had given him did not exist. This marked the start of his search for his niece. He contacted Afghan politicians and Western embassies, but no one could tell him anything about Aisha's whereabouts. After months had gone by, he received a call from an unknown number. A man on the other end of the line explained to him in Pashto that Aisha was being treated in a hospital in Washington, D.C., thanks to Solace for the Children, an American NGO that facilitates medical care for injured children from war-torn regions. The conversation left Maya convinced that Aisha was taken to the United States in order to hide her from the public eye. So if I go now into the details, I think we'll lose too much time. But to summarize this part of the chapter, and before hopping to the next part of what I'm going to read, Aisha was in fact, it was a detailed operation, a precise operation to get her out of Afghanistan so that she's out of the spotlight and nobody could visit her. No journalists in Kabul could visit her because she was hid in a rural area of Afghanistan, in a remote village in Convenor province, as I said. And afterwards, she was first brought to a hospital in the provincial capital of Asadabad, which does not have many resources. So afterwards, again, she was brought to Jalalabad, which is the capital of Nangarhar province in Afghanistan's east, with a bigger hospital. But ultimately, she was brought to the French hospital in Kabul. So if you have someone like that in Kabul, of course, during that time, also today, but during that time especially, it was just a matter of time until you get attention. And during that time in Kabul, the few days she stayed there, she was even visited by then Afghan President Hamid Karzai. And afterwards, she was brought out of the country. And until today, we have here different narratives. On the one side, we have the family, which still claims that they didn't sign anything and they didn't give any, okay to get her out of the country. On the other side, you have people from the US installed Afghan government back then, Karzai administration. They keep saying that the family was agreeing with everything. And last but not least, you have this kind of shady NGO which brought Aisha out of the country, but which also has ties, also back then had ties with the US military. So Aisha is just one example of what happened in Afghanistan, and there have been many Aishas, while at the same time, unfortunately, you had all these people claiming that this was a fight for women's rights and so on. But I think, especially after August 2021, it became clear that all of it was a lie, because Afghanistan is being now ruled again by the people who once were brought down by the Americans and their allies. And we can talk hours about how this happened, why it happened. I tried to summarize it in one chapter. It's called Retroperspective, America's Failure Explained by One Village. And it's a rather short chapter, but I think it gives a good overview of what was actually happening on the ground. Musawi District, Kabul Province, March 2019. A small group of men and boredom-prone children stand by the riverside. All of them stare at the contraption before them, a small water pump that, despite their best efforts, won't turn on. A young man tries to set it in motion by pushing at the gear and pulling at the engine, all the while concentrating on the tube protruding from the lifeless pump. The water in the river remains still and calm. The pump, sent by a relative who spent the last 2 decades in Germany, simply won't work. It's an all too typical story in Musawi, around 19 miles south of the capital itself, where, for as long as memory recalls, many things have not functioned. Much like Musawi's water pump, most of Afghanistan doesn't function either, at least outside the major cities. And even if the then newly re-elected president, Ashraf Ghani, did his best to try to improve things, he would have a hard time holding off the Taliban. 18 years after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, the capital city of Kabul has undergone several transformations. The city is dotted with high rises that fill the skyline. Roads are slowly and painstakingly being paved. The monuments of eras gone by are being renovated. Sorry, it's sometimes a bit difficult to read constantly from the screen. I just noticed that. A small-moneyed class, cosmopolitan and more connected with other global capitals than the countryside a mere drive away, fuels the slow growth of Western-style coffee shops across the city, complete with increasingly popular $1 lattes. More than half of the country's population, meanwhile, lies on less than $1 a day. The transformation is topped off with mansions and fancy wedding halls, effectively barricaded compounds where urban elites display obscene wealth. The dystopian picture is complete with a short drive south of the city, wherein lies a different world, a world left behind and pummeled by years of poverty and war. Musawi has been part of Kabul province for decades now, but in 2019, it is part of a growing area of Kabul's outskirts falling under the steadily darkening Taliban shadow. Although not visible during the day, the fall of darkness is accompanied by them erecting the checkpoints. This reality has not and will not change, even after the release of the final results of what ended up being the occupation era's last presidential elections. After 5 months of waiting, Ashraf Ghani has been declared the winner. His rival is the former Foreign Minister Abdullah, who had also contested him in 2014's elections. In 2014, too, Abdullah had disputed the results of elections that were widely agreed to be fraudulent. He was only pacified through a US-brokered power-sharing agreement that made him the National Unity Government's chief executive, a position created just for him, and like much of the government's machinery, without legal or constitutional basis. So back then, John Kerry came 3 times to Kabul and told Abdullah, you're now the CEO of Afghanistan. And the Afghan people were like, What the hell is going on? Is this an election or just a selection by the Americans? A reminder what happened back then. Despite the theatrics, no doubt entertaining for many, Abdullah and Ghani have lost support in rural places like Musawi. During their presidential election campaign, while the political elites in the city celebrated their much-touted but hollow democracy, the people of Musawi were shut out from the political process entirely. The Taliban's predominance precluded travel into the capital and the resultant opportunity to engage the candidates directly during the live televised interviews. Conversely, it also precluded the possibility of the candidates being able to campaign or even visit what was a district of Kabul. On election day, the very real threat of Taliban attack meant that the polling stations remained closed. So no election, Musawi. The signs of failure are written all over Musawi, and many residents, unsurprisingly, expressed their dissatisfaction with the nation's leadership. Many also vocally support the Taliban. Within the district, soldiers of the Afghan National Army, created and trained by the US and its allies after 2001, are disregarded. The war was, in many respects, lost before it was fought. Soldiers knew that it was Taliban country. Entering it would needlessly risk their lives. Few of them appear periodically for Friday prayers. When they do, they look insecure and nervous. As it turned out, they knew perhaps better than even the Taliban that the war was lost. They just want to leave as soon as possible. They knew that nobody wants to see them here, said a resident. The truth was that many soldiers, if any, could make it past the marked checkpoint on the bridge that marked the entrance to the district itself. Several residents I spoke to complained about corrupt local government officials and voiced support for the Taliban. Unlike government officials, they argued, the Taliban actually got things done. For instance, long-standing family feuds common across the country are finally being resolved by the Taliban. This is the Taliban's court. They have the control here, says a local who wanted to remain unnamed. Many rural districts in Afghanistan are already fully controlled by or under the influence of the Taliban. According to various estimates from that time, more than half of the country is contested or controlled by them. The reality had been and remains largely ignored. This reality had been and remains largely ignored in both Washington and Kabul. Instead, the US government tries to paint a different picture of the war, one dominated by white lies, omissions, and exaggerations. Musawi, barely a stone's throw away from the nation's capital, is a prime example of exactly what went wrong over 20 years. Washington had poured more than $2 trillion into the country without much to show for it. The only aid that could be found in Musawi is a defective German water pump from the 1950s, when this country was ruled by a monarchy that enjoyed relations with Germany and its two governments on either side of the Berlin Wall. There has not been any other aid. We have many problems here, especially with farming. But as you can see, we have to figure out how this pump works. It is sad that we remained that backward, but nobody is interested in our cause, said Muhammad Asif, a farmer from a village in the district. Like many Afghans, Asif hopes that peace talks with the Taliban will be successful. He and his fellow villagers at long last could just focus on rebuilding their homes. We can live in poverty, but not without peace. We cannot move freely at night. There's always fighting between the army and the insurgents. We need a peace deal that serves the interests of all Afghans, he underlined. Mohammad Shaheen, who lives in Kabul but visits Musail regularly with his family, believes that the government would continue to be careless about the daily problems of the villages. This is the closest district to the capital. The presidential palace is only 15 kilometers away from here, but we have so many problems here in terms of economy and security. The government does not care, he says. Musawi might have been a short drive from the palace, a part of the province. Both the president and chief executive have resided in for decades, but the people there continue to feel politically hopeless. helpless. Musawi is just one example out of many. Often it appears as Darul Afghanistan does not exist in the minds of many urbanites. In some respects, this wasn't entirely new. Especially in Kabul, political elites had always lived in their own bubble. When the British twice invaded Afghanistan in the 19th century, their installed monarchs ruled in Kabul as rural Afghans organized resistance. When the Soviets invaded the country in 1979, people in the cities benefited often handsomely from housing projects and infrastructure. Hundreds of villages, meanwhile, were wiped off the map by the Soviet Red Army and its Afghan communist allies. The government of Ashraf Ghani, today mainly known so in 2024, mainly known as Afghanistan's runaway president who left the country after the Taliban returned on August 15, 2021, was not able to change these long-standing realities. Instead, the Western-backed regime subsumed that attitude and took it to astronomical heights. Ghani's government largely consisted of westernized technocrats, often with dual citizenships, often unable to speak the local languages, but prized for their impressive Western degrees. This could be observed in every aspect of life. In the context of ongoing peace talks with the Taliban, for example, many rural Afghans, like those in Musawi, welcomed any kind of violence reduction and appeared optimistic, while large parts of the country's urban elites feared for their lucrative and powerful positions. As of August 2019, Ghani celebrates the 100th anniversary of Afghanistan's independence in Kabul's newly renovated Dalaman Palace. American airstrikes and night raids conducted by CIA-backed Afghan militias concurrently have dramatically increased in the country's rural side. At the same time, insurgent violence escalated and large parts of the country were under Taliban control. Last but not least, Ghani's entire government was and remains dependent on economic and military aid from the US and its allies. To many Afghans, it appeared more than paradoxical to celebrate an alleged independence under such circumstances. However, many Afghans and non-Afghans have no idea how haunting these realities of Musawi and many other rural regions of the country would become, and that in the end, everything would collapse. So I will stop here with reading, Paniz, if that's okay for you, because I'm focusing a bit on time. And there's another chapter I saved. And I think if we have some time at the end, maybe I can finish with this chapter.
Sounds like a wonderful idea, right? Yeah. Sorry?
I think that's perfect because it's so much to like digest.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
Audience agrees. Yeah, first, thank you so much for this for now, right?
Thank you. Paniz, maybe just one hint. I think you have to stay a bit closer to the mic because sometimes.
Like this?
Yeah, maybe that's too much. It's you shouldn't feel uncomfortable.
Okay, let's try. Maybe we find a good balance.
Yeah,
But,
I think.
yeah,
No, so it's also fine. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated that you also chose like these sections. I think you beautifully, these are beautifully written chapters that you shared with us. And so I was wondering, maybe to start off the conversation, if you could share with us why you chose the title Graveyard Empire for your book, which inverts the much cited expression Afghanistan, Graveyard of Empires.
Yes, so the original version of the book was the längste Krieg, the longest war, which is, I think, a known term in the US. And we decided to choose another title. I think it was also in 2020 or in 2021 when I wrote a long essay for foreign policy, and the title of the essay was the graveyard, not the graveyard of empires, but Empire of Graveyards. This was the title of this essay. And I liked that, so I suggested this for this book. And at the first, the first design draft, you could just see Graveyard Empire, and the publisher said, yeah, we have to fix this. And I was like, I showed this also to some friends of mine, and we all shared the conclusion that this sounds quite good. So let's just keep it like that, Graveyard Empire. And why? Because, yeah, of course, we all know Empire of Graveyard. Graveyard of Empires. I'm sorry, Graveyard of Empires is this typical cliche term of how Afghanistan has often been characterized by many analysts. Like they keep saying, since Alexander the Great, the region is the graveyard of empires, and so on and so on. But I think that it's mainly the graveyard of Afghans, of our people. And also, when you drive through Afghanistan, what you mostly see in every province are just graveyards. You see so many graveyards, you see so many graves. There are also so many graves of Afghan people which has not been found until today. For example, a few months ago, they found a new mass grave in Khost province, which was like 40 years old or something like that. So yeah, it's like against the narrative of romanticizing Afghanistan and like mixing it with this kind of Orientalism, that it is the graveyard of empires, and these people, they love to fight and they are so good at fighting and they break the neck of every empire. It's about focusing on the lives of the people who are living there and who died there.
Thank you so much. So thinking about the human cost of the war, right? And the complicity of Germany, while consecutive German governments claimed over the course of 2 decades that NATO troops and the parallel development policies were bringing peace and stability allegedly to Afghanistan, the human and material cost of the war consistently rose, right? As you also captured in your chapters. You mentioned the work also in your book, you mentioned the work of John Sopko, who was the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, whose office was established in 2008 by the US Congress to, and I quote, provide independent and objective oversight of Afghanistan's reconstruction projects and activities, end of quote. But there was no comparable oversight body in Germany. And it has to be said that Germany was the second largest donor of aid to Afghanistan after the US. And the German government published a series of progress reports on Afghanistan from 2010 to 2014 and in 2018, called in German Fortschrittsberichte Afghanistan. And you have been closely following and writing about the work of the Enquete Commission in Germany, whose mandate is to assess, and I quote, lessons from Afghanistan for Germany's future networked engagement, end of quote, so looking at the time of the occupation from 2001 to 2021, which is of course not called occupation, but Afghanistan mission. In the vote on the motion to establish the committee in the Bundestag, the German parliament, the parliamentary group of Die Linke, the left party, abstained and rejected the motion to establish the commission. It called for an investigation into the overall duration of the deployment, noting that the Enquete Commission could not perform this task, and I quote, as it would not have the means of the Code of Criminal Procedure at its disposal, end of quote. So what does this mean for the process of reappraisal and reparations pertaining to Afghan survivors of NATO's war and occupation, in which Germany, as mentioned, was the second largest donor after the US? And what does this mean for the environment in Afghanistan that has been subjected to protracted destruction, intoxication, pollution, as well as simultaneously climate change?
Yes, thanks for this question and all the details. So the thing is that also the main occupiers, the main military occupiers of Afghanistan were US soldiers, and like, other NATO forces were like dragged in because of the Americans, as they still try to justify it until today. And the Germans also say that like they had to go with the Americans inside because of 9/11 and because of what happened. it is worth noting that, first of all, most of my work is focusing on, of course, on what the US military did in Afghanistan. But because of my relation to Germany and my Germany background, I'm not German, I'm Austrian, but I'm living here in Germany. I also focus I also focused on these things. And what my conclusion on that is, in many aspects, is that like in Germany you didn't have anything like Sobko's SIGA reports, which were rather critical, which were also appreciated by many critics of the war because they were very detailed and they questioned a lot of developments in Afghanistan. I think that at least within the US government you could find people who tried to be critical towards what happened, and they knew a lot of things and sent it over to their superiors, and they ignored it. Like we saw this when the so-called Afghanistan papers were published, which was mainly based on Sobko's work, and many things that were sensationalized back then when the papers were published were pretty much known amongst critics of the war. So in the US, at least you could see some kind of development like this. In Germany, it was absolutely non-existent. Like nothing like that existed there. And you could see, you have prime examples where you could even see that there is no shame for anything within the German political landscape when it comes to the failures of the Afghanistan war. Let me give you a prime example. It's the bombardment of Kunduz in the north of the country in 2009, a case I'm also mentioning in this book. Back then, NATO forces bombed more than 150 people to death in Kunduz province because a German colonel back then, he came to the conclusion that all these people on the ground are Taliban fighters and they are threatening us because they hijacked 2 trucks, fully loaded with gas, and now he fantasized things. He was like, this truck is now coming to our base and all our soldiers are in danger, so we have to bomb them. He gave the American pilot the order to bomb, and he killed more than 150 civilians. Afterwards, it became clear that, first of all, it was a war crime, and secondly, even this guy, his name was Klein. His last name was Colonel Klein. That's how he became famous throughout the German media. Colonel Klein even violated NATO rules. So NATO rules are also not known, especially in Afghanistan, for being like super pro human rights or something like that. But he clearly violated even the rules of NATO and did many things wrong. And yeah, but he didn't see any kind of punishment within Germany. Today, Colonel Klein is General Klein, so he has been promoted. His victims are still fighting for any kind of reparation. I know the lawyer of the victims. His name is Karim Popal. He is a German Afghan who is living here in Germany for a long time. And he still represents the victims of this bombardment because they didn't get anything. And what the German government back then just did with the military was working with some of its own corrupt officials on the ground, handing them some cash, and then afterwards claiming that they gave the money to the victims. And Colonel Klein himself didn't face any kind of persecution within Germany. It was all rejected. And back then, even Der Spiegel wrote that, I mean, the Spiegel blamed Chancellor Angela Merkel and back the then Defense Ministry of Germany for like whitewashing this war crime and ignoring it. Nothing happened since then. The Enquete Commission you mentioned published a report a few weeks ago, and like in the case of Kunduz, many people who are involved in this commission have never been on the ground in Afghanistan, have never been at any place in Afghanistan. Also, the guy, for example, the Karim Popal, the lawyer of the victims, for example, back then when he made his investigation, he was the only person who visited actually the victims and went to Kunduz by himself several times and collected all the data. Nobody else did this. No German official, no NATO official, no US official. Nobody did this. He did it by himself. And now you have this commission with, again, people who have no experience. You have people who are actively warmongers, you could say, people who have close ties with the arms lobby and so on. Such people are part of the commission, and obviously they came to a very, in my eyes, shocking conclusion, because they published a report which has more than 300 pages, and just on one page, on half of, you find one page, and just half of the page is somehow mentioning the mistakes of NATO forces about civilian casualties and airstrikes and so on. So it's just a total whitewashing. And I also know from other people that, people who really have Afghanistan experience, people who are also critical and have, proven knowledge about what happened, they have not been invited to talk there. And I doubt that this will change.
I was actually asked, but I refused.
You are okay, really?
Because of the
Maybe I understand why you did that.
Yeah,
I
no,
totally
like
understand
framing
that. Another friend of mine told me the same. I think no, she said if they asked me, I had refused.
Yeah.
So, but I wasn't. I had one weird experience. Some people from the leftist party, Die Linke, reached me out and wanted me to. They wanted me to invite. They wanted that I come to the, speak for some hours as some kind of expert. And then they called me 2 times, and they also interviewed me for an hour, like via Zoom. And afterwards, I didn't hear anything from them.
Yeah, no, same. I was also like, someone reached out from.
Yeah, it's a waste of time. I think that's also very disrespectful doing something like that. But I didn't expect much. I mean, just to drop into to make a jump into the present, if people who see what is happening in Germany right now because of the events in the Middle East might not be surprised that this is kind of mainstream German behavior. And there is a fundamental problem within the German society, how to how to have a critical debate on things.
This also leads us then to the question of actually how memory construction under such, in such structures can look like. And I was wondering, in your book, but also your wider intellectual and aesthetic work, including the virtual memorial for the victims of drone warfare in Afghanistan, memory construction plays a central role, right? And you explain in your beautifully written final chapters, and I do believe you also make this also quite clear throughout your book, that you do not romanticize any era in Afghanistan, but you do point out the reign of Zahir Shah, particularly the 1960s and 1970s, and write that, I quote, "the generation that had the privilege to experience the time of freedom," referring to the years of the monarchy, "is shrinking every day," end of quote. And you go on and emphasize that, I quote, "this is by no means a question of nostalgia or historical revisionism. Rather, the memory of this era is important for promoting a new intra-Afghan reconciliation," end of quote. And I'm really interested in the potential you see in this memory. Can you elaborate on the political and imaginary potential you see in it? Can such memories possibly also serve as a point of departure to decipher what historiographer Shah Mahmoud Hanifi calls crypto-colonial narratives regarding Afghanistan's alleged independence in 1919? Can memories cater to unraveling the continuous proximity and romance between the monarchy and the US, UK, and German institutions and organizations and media in the present?
Yes, let me try let me try to answer this question. Let's start with the monarchy and Zahra Shah. So, if you asked me 10 or 12 years ago, I might have been much more critical towards the monarchy and everything. I heard about it. I didn't live amongst that time, obviously, but like, when you hear about monarchies and kings and so on, you're like, okay, it's good that we're over this, and it's part of the past. But during the last years, during my work, I interviewed many Afghans from all over the world, within the diaspora, but also many people in Afghanistan, many people in Pakistan, many people from Iran. So I try to talk to as many people as possible from all different kinds of classes and ethnic backgrounds and political backgrounds. And what I noticed is that a lot of them, also the highly political ones from both camps, like for example the leftists or communists, whatever you want to call them, or the Islamists, um, those camps who fought each other. Even amongst them, you would find people now who say, okay, back then we didn't know it, but now we know that probably we did mistakes in terms of how we viewed the monarchy, how we understood the ideas of the king and what he was going to do with the country. And the more I thought about it, I came to a similar conclusion. And I think that what many people mean is that back then, and this is also why I highlighted this in the book, because back then you could see, like in the 60s, you could see some kind of Afghan democracy experiment from within, led by King Zahir Shah, and how he himself, I personally think that if this succeeded, he himself maybe would have distanced himself more and more from politics, and then Afghanistan would have made a very different kind of evolution. And unfortunately, this did not happen. And now you see a lot of people from this era, like people from my parents or from our parents' generation, like regretting it. And at the same time, when I say I don't want to romanticize what was happening back then, is that of course the king was the king. He was a ruler. He banned political parties. We had parliamentary elections, which was quite something, but he officially banned political parties. And he also lived in his own bubble, and that's again like the Kabul bubble was also something that I always witnessed during my reporting during the last decade. And this is something that it's also difficult for me when I talk for example, when I talk to my father about these things. It's kind of difficult because he's also like dreaming in nostalgia what was happening back then, because my father left Afghanistan more than 40 years ago and never returned. And he just saw Kabul and Jalalabad maybe 1 or 2 days. And so 2 cities. Although these cities were back then, they were much more smaller, but it was still an urban area. He lived in a very privileged life because my grandfather was also a very privileged person. He was very well educated. He had a Western university degree, and he sent his children to Europe to study and to come back and serve the country. So they had this kind of attitude. But I often told him, yeah, listen, the thing is that, in my opinion, you and many others of your urbanite generation, they never saw the real the large parts of Afghanistan, the parts I saw, the parts that people, the parts where people suffered for decades and decades and decades, and even during the era of the king. Because what you also often hear is, from people from that era, is that like the only thing we had was that there was no war, but yeah, there was hunger, there was poverty, all these things existed. And why did they exist? Now coming back to the other part of your question, it's because of, yeah, what you could call a fake independence of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan wasn't really independent and was always stuck between empires. and especially what the British did with their during the three Anglo-Afghan wars, and the creation of the colonial borders back then, especially the Durand Line, which is now separating Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is still considered by many as a colonial line, and which is not accepted by many people. You know, we still suffer from these things, and it's also a fair question to say, okay, you know, what could political leaders during the last decades actually do to get out of this misery? But when it comes to the dialogue itself, I think that's a crucial part, that like all these people with different experiences, they need to talk more and more with each other, and sit together, come to conclusion, because ultimately that was at least the feeling I had when it's the feeling I still have until today, that although a lot of them think that they came from so many different camps, at the end of the day, they're still all in the same boat. And unfortunately, we had so many missed opportunities to come to such a conclusion on the highest political levels. One of the chapters in the book, one of the last chapters, is about two booksellers who are working next to each other in Kabul, two friends of mine, and they saw the rise and fall of many political regimes. And one of them was once part of the Afghan communists, of the army back then, 1980s, early 1980s. And the other one was a Mujahideen fighter who killed Russian soldiers. And now I think for more than almost 20 years, they're sitting next to each other and selling books. And of course, there are many opinions where they still there are many opinions they still do not share with each other, but they are friends, they are part of like one family, and they don't, you would not find any hostility between them. And I liked it back then in 2021, early 2021. They said, yeah, the way we found to each other and made peace, that's also possible for the whole country, because actually the whole country is a family that needs to make peace with each other.
Thank you, Emran. Do we have questions in the online audience or here? In the online audience?
I see the questions here, by the way.
All right. So, can you hear me? There is one
I can
from
hear you, yes.
Michelle Durrani, who asks, you discuss in your book some of the greatest failures of the US military occupation in Afghanistan. In your opinion, how did the facade or narrative of success continue throughout media, politics, and books for so long, despite all the on-the-ground failures?
Yes, I see the question too. So the thing is, I think that, and that's what I often said, and what back then many people kind of did not want to hear, is that a lot of media coverage which came from Afghanistan was mainly focused on the city of Kabul, but it wasn't even focused on the whole city of Kabul. It was just focused on several parts of the city, like the Green Zone, Shordenau, Wazir Akbar Khan, the places where you would find NGOs, foreign embassies, journalists, the media NGO bubble. And to be honest, when I was a teenager and when I saw the news and I saw some of these reporters talking from Kabul, I was kind of skeptical, because they said things which did not fit into what I heard through my family or through other friends and acquaintances. So I was like, okay, what does it actually mean if someone reports from Kabul? If it says that someone is reporting from Kabul, Afghanistan? And when I went to do this myself, like as a reporter, trying to witness what was happening on the ground. I saw that a lot of these journalists who work from known mainstream news channels, from CNN to BBC to German news channels, ARD, ZDF, all of them, they're actually they face a lot of restrictions, and they cannot actually report in a way which many people would imagine that it is actually happening. It's not happening. I had a lot of colleagues, I visited them in their offices in Kabul, and when they asked me, okay, what are you doing? What is your plan? And I told them, okay, listen, I travel to this area or I go to this village. They were like, man, I'm so jealous of what you're doing because I'm not allowed to do this because of all the security protocol and so on. I can't do this. So good luck. I did it because I thought it was important. I didn't do it for the money because if you count the money, it's nothing. It's like there's a lot of exploitation within the media business. And if you think you become rich by becoming a freelance war reporter, let me tell you that that's absolutely not the case. And so, yeah, for me, it was just important to do this. And let me also mention another anecdote. I remember it was from 2021, June 2021, when during an awards ceremony in Vienna, capital of Austria, and me and an Afghan colleague of mine, we got a journalism award. And afterwards, a veteran reporter came to us, an Austrian man, and he congratulated us. And then he told me, I was also 2 times in Afghanistan. And I was like, okay, cool. Which places did you visit? And he said, I was in Uruzgan province, embedded with the Dutch military. And actually, and these are his words, he said, I didn't talk with a single Afghan. So he was embedded with the military. He had to face a lot of barriers, cultural barriers, language barriers, and there were like huge restrictions from the military. And this is also one of the problems, trying to answer your question, Michelle. You got a lot of embedded reporting. You got a lot of narratives which claimed that they were like, listen, this is happening here in Afghanistan, but actually it wasn't happening in all of Afghanistan. It was just a minor part of the capital, and this was never like you could never expand this to the whole country. But unfortunately, this happened over and over again. Like in Germany, also, you had all these reports like we're building schools, and now here you can see some female artists from Kabul, and we gave them the freedom and so on. This was absolutely not the full picture. And you can do this for some years. You can even do this for 20 years, but at the end, it won't work.
Thank you, Emran. We have 2 more questions at the moment, and then
okay, yeah,
final reading, if that makes sense, right?
Yes.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a 7th-year doctoral student here in art history. So this is all very, thank you so much for reading your writing and such a deep and complex and challenging subject matter. I have so many questions, but I think the first one, and I'll only ask one, and apologies if I totally missed this, but what ended up happening to Aisha?
Yes, you missed this because I didn't read it. Aisha stayed with the family in the United States, as far as I know. And I'm not sure I think I heard that they also have some Afghan background, but she was kind of lost and disconnected from Afghanistan for a couple of years. And there was an American journalist ultimately who went back with her to Convenor province. I think it was between 2018 or 2019. You would find a nice report, a long essay about it at The Intercept. And this essay of her describes how she was accompanying her back to her Afghan family in rural Afghanistan. And yeah, it's a very tragic story. But she got some surgical operations and so on in the United States, as far as I know, and now she's well, fortunately. So she's having a good life, and she's not living in Afghanistan anymore. But of course, the trauma is still there from all what happened.
Yeah, I mean, so, and then kind of a separate but related question, I suppose, if that's okay.
Of course.
So the situation that happened in Afghanistan, and I'm coming from an art history background here, so please excuse the simplicity or naivete here, but it seems like it has happened before in other wars, especially that the US is involved with, this need of, or this total annihilation, and then the kind of need for reparations and kind of, cleaning up our mess, if you will. So is there, when you talk about, and perhaps your book goes into it, but is there a model for, because I think what you mentioned earlier, there's this, the one, the big elephant in the room is what is going to, how do these people get remunerated, and how do we help them? Where are the reparations? Are there other models that, or does this need to be completely conceptualized? Because and I'm sure if there are other models that exist, they're very imperfect and flawed, but just wondering, in your opinion.
Yes, of course. Thanks for this important question. But to be honest, I mean, I'm not aware of any other successful models, but I think there are some basic things that need to be done, but which haven't been done in Afghanistan, but also in other war areas affected by this kind of warfare, from Pakistan to Somalia to Yemen. So first of all, there's always the same denialism. We didn't do it, we didn't do it, we didn't do it, until someone goes out and finds out, okay, you did it. And then the next step is, if it comes out that something like that happens, you cannot have some kind of investigation conducted by the power who did it. You need independent investigators, and you need to support them. This never happened in Afghanistan after such cases. Nothing, except of journalists and some human rights organizations. Nobody cared about it. And last but not least, you should find a proper system of how to reparate it. Of course, you cannot revive someone with the money, the victims, everyone knows that. But it's kind of macabre that you see cases like, okay, the car was damaged, you get $1,500. The daughter was killed, you get $200 for that. So all these things happened. And I think there are just too many flaws, and we still do not see any kind of power who could challenge that and who could find a proper system that, first of all, that it shouldn't happen at all, but if it happens, to proceed in a human rights based way. And yeah, I hope this is I hope this is a satisfying answer, but I'm just trying to be honest here. I don't know any model where this works. I haven't seen anything like that. But when it comes to reparations, if you compare it again, it's also interesting, because the more media attention something gets, the more reparations are, or used to be, at least in the case of the United States. For example, there was the massacre of Kandahar in March 2012, when American soldier Robert Bales killed 19 civilians in 2 villages. This is the official narrative. Until today, Afghans say that this was not a single culprit. This was not a single culprit, and several soldiers went to these 2 villages just because of the distance between the 2 villages. It was not possible to do it, to have one soldier doing it. But after it happened, after this massacre happened, you had a lot of media attention, because all of this quickly reached Kabul back then. And the president back, Hamid Karzai, was also, he was in his phase where he became more and more critical towards the United States. So it reached political elites in Kabul, it reached the media, and also international media. And it was so obvious that nobody could deny it. So the first thing that happened was they found this guy, Robert Bales, and brought him out of the country so that he could not face any Afghan court. And afterwards, the Afghans themselves started an investigation. And what I just mentioned before was just the result of the investigation. So the single culprit theory and so on. But what I wanted to say is that as far as I know, the families of the victims got a lot of money for what happened. One of the guys, Muhammad Wazir was his name. I also talked to him. He lost, I think, 14 family members or 10 family members. And he received, as far as I know, $500,000 per victim. So yes, that's a lot of money. Of course, no money can bring back the victim, but it's a difference than considering what you could see in other cases or what I just mentioned before with the Germans. So there are things that you can do, but if you have no attention and nothing and no investigation, nothing happens.
We have one more question from the online audience, and then do you
Yes,
think
let me check this. Yeah, I can see it too, I think.
does the time suffice for this last question and for you to close the event with the part from your book that you wanted to share with us?
Yes, of course, if time allows it, why not?
Yeah, we have
How much time do we have left?
7 minutes as of now.
7 minutes. Okay.
Or to reply to the question? Should we?
Yeah, I will reply to the question, and maybe I summarize the chapter. And the chapter, yeah, I think maybe I summarize it by talking about it. But okay.
Let me, because now there's a new one. I
Yes.
think the first one was by Diana Hayder. Other than
Yes,
one-on-one.
I see both of them.
Let me just read it for the
Okay.
audience.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I hope they're like, or not. I'm not sure if they're seeing it or not. Other than one-on-one interviews with Afghans for your book, what other resources did you use to write your book? Do you have recommendations of literature on the unbiased history of Afghanistan that served you for the writing of your book, or for understanding the history prior to the US invasion of Afghanistan?
Yes, thank you, Diana. So I assume that maybe you're Afghan. So what I would suggest is that there are a lot of resources that are not in English, but in Farsi and Pashto, things that you can read, things that you can hear, things that you would find on YouTube. There have been many excellent political experts, which I also talked with, but which I also just listened to when they talked at talk shows, at Afghan TV. And there's also a lot of insightful English literature that I used. There are some excellent books. For example, recently published book I would highly recommend is Night Letters by a colleague of mine, Fazl Minallah Qazizai, and his colleague Chris Sands. It was published with Hearst, a London publisher. So it's a very fat book, but it's excellent when it comes to the basics and details of Afghan history. But of course, I'm just taking here what I also have. But what I would highly suggest to my fellow Afghans is please, do not, of course, the diaspora and everything you find in German or in English is important, but make a deep dive into what is actually coming from your country and from your people in the local languages. I noticed that often people don't speak them very well or don't understand it, which is understandably if you grew up in the diaspora. But if you really want to get knowledge, and if you want to work on these things, it's maybe a burden, but you have to learn it. For example, my mother tongue is Farsi, and I learned Pashto, a second Afghan language, much later. But it's important to know this kind of stuff.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Emran. And I would now like, if you like to share with us those.
Yes.
We have about 4 minutes. I don't know, how long do you think? Is that
Okay, I will try to make
or to summarize?
Yeah, I will summarize. So the last chapter is called Checkpoint Realities. I wrote it in 2022, and it's about my first return to Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. And you know, I was always traumatized by checkpoints. I'm traumatized by checkpoints until today. If I drive from Germany to Austria, when I pass the border and I see a checkpoint, I kind of become nervous because I'm back in this Afghanistan mode, and I think, okay, now we have like some violent militia, Taliban extremists or whoever. Like I have to answer stupid questions and I have to act cool, because things like that. And the new checkpoint realities of Afghanistan are that you just have one checkpoint, like the checkpoints of the Taliban, and the Taliban took over. The Taliban came to stay, and they are stronger than ever before. They have the whole of Afghanistan, something that they did not control back then in the late 1990s. And in this chapter, I'm trying to explain how difficult these realities, these new checkpoints have become for many people. For example, also many people in Afghanistan have language barriers. The people of Kabul mostly speak Farsi. You have many rural Taliban who are Pashtuns, who mainly speak Pashto with many different dialects. So I noticed how a lot of friends or relatives of mine who are from Kabul and who were with me in the car, they could not even properly communicate with the Taliban, and were just nervous when they faced them, for good reason. Another thing is that for many of the people in the cities, it was a new experience to learn and see the Taliban, because until 2021, during the 20 years of the Republic, they just knew them from suicide attacks and all these kinds of things that happened during the war. And now there's like the police, okay? They are the new army, and they are the new authorities, and you're forced to respect them because you have no other chance. And in the diaspora, and on the other side of the coin, you have many people talking, and they have a lot of privileges to say certain things, to act in a certain way, while a lot of people in Afghanistan, of course, are still trying to get out of the country. That's also what I'm mentioning in this chapter. But a lot of them are also forced to stay. And the chapter ends with a friend of mine who was driving with us in Bamiyan province, where we faced the Taliban checkpoint, which made us some problems, which interrogated us, which took away our mobile phones, and which threatened us. And because, you know, we listened music in the car and we did some other stuff, which wasn't okay in their eyes. So this driver of us, he said this is the last time he faced this. In the 1990s, he was forced to give them his music cassettes, and he remembered an anecdote where he destroyed the cassettes in front of the Talib fighter himself before giving it to him. And he said he does not want to have such an experience again. So his plan was to go and leave Afghanistan with his family, especially because of his daughters, because these daughters are not allowed to go to school anymore or to go to the university anymore. So he said his plan was to go to Iran. He's now living in Iran as a refugee, and he sounded kind of hopeful, like maybe there is a chance to go from Iran to another country and finally arrive to Europe. And many Afghans also have a very romanticized image of the West of Europe and the United States. And I ended with with a very special sentence in this chapter, and asked myself, okay, now he's going to leave, but will he ever arrive? And it was called also a hint to my own family history, and I think also to the destiny of many, many Afghans around the globe.
Imran, thank you so very much. What a great note to end on. Thank you very, very much for sharing your book with us and for your time. I know it's very late, so deep appreciation for.
Well, thank you. And again, oh, I see here another question, Catherine Johnson. The book is called Night Letters. Yeah.
We can forward you the questions. We'll download the questions.
Okay.
Couldn't
The
reply.
book is called Night Letters by Pardizai and Sands. But yeah, again, thanks a lot for having me. It's very, very unfortunate that I could not be there, and you know, being there in person, I was very looking forward to it. But hopefully another time, let's see what what the authorities have for me.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, Emran.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you, Paniz. Thank Griffin. Thanks to the audience. Thank you.